before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Tell me, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? I read every comment, and I love knowing where history finds you. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We explore the forgotten corners of the past, slowly, gently, in stories designed to help you unwind, drift, and maybe even fall asleep. Now, let's begin. Asterisk, beneath the brittle sun of March 1799. The port city of Jaffa simmered like a kettle without a whistle. It was quiet in the wrong ways too, still for a place meant to teem with trade, olive carts, and voices calling out over spices and sea breeze. Instead, the city smelled of something else entirely: gunpowder, scorched earth, and something subtler. Something gnawing at the edges of sanity. Napoleon Bonaparte had just taken the city after a brutal siege. And though his cannons had broken through walls of stone, it was the silence afterward that unnerved even the most hardened soldiers. The enemy had fallen, but something else lingered. The sandstone streets were narrow, their shadows long, and the corners always seemed to twitch. At night, men swore the stones moved. Some muttered about curses. Others complained of fever dreams and scratching sounds beneath the bedrolls. But the truth was more pedestrian, more mundane, and infinitely more horrifying. Rats. Thousands of them. Jaffa was not built to be sanitary. The siege had only worsened. It staked. Blood soaked the cobbled alleys. Dead bodies lay piled in courtyards, and the heat began to rise. Within days, rats long-bodied, black-eyed, relentless swarmed through barracks, bread stores, infirmaries. They chewed through boots. They nested in the hair of the sleeping. They carried something far worse than panic: disease. The French medics tried to maintain some order, while with wounded soldiers crammed into what had once been merchant homes, their open wounds attracting flies and fur alike. Infection became routine. One young corporal wrote in a now-lost letter, "We do not fear the British here. We fear the mouths that never speak but always bite." The pestilence spread fast. Dysentery, typhus, and something stranger still, black marks on the legs. Delirium, death within a day. Was it plague? Many believed so. In truth, it was a mix of everything: poor sanitation, dying horses, rotting stores, and constant infestation. Napoleon did what he could. He visited the sick, or at least he made sure to be seen visiting the sick. One famous painting would later immortalize this: the commander walking among dying men, hand outstretched, stoic and brave. But the reality was quieter and perhaps more tragic. The general had begun to fear something he couldn't order away. Not a fortress, not a government, not even a British fleet, but disease. It had always hovered at the edge of his campaigns, the silent third enemy that no musket could stop. But here, in Jaffa, with rats slipping across sleeping soldiers, in a night full of rustling, that fear became tangible. He ordered some of the sick to be given laudanum opium laced with wine, officially to calm them, unofficially to ease their passing. One of the surgeons protested, but not too loudly. It wasn't the first time the empire had resorted to mercy before medicine. Meanwhile, the rats grew braver. They no longer waited for darkness. They skittered across shoes at noon, scurried between officers' legs during briefings, and nibbled at the parchment of orders before they could be delivered. Some soldiers took to lighting fires in the corners of rooms, not for warmth, but to frighten off the rodents. It worked briefly, but smoke was poor armor against starvation, and the rats were no fools. They adapted. They endured. Much like the soldiers themselves, a peculiar pattern emerged. The sickest camps were not those closest to the former enemy fortifications, but those near the bakery stores and wine cellars, places rats had claimed. Wherever flour went missing, illness followed within days. Still, The men were told to hold position. Napoleon had other worries too. Hey, word had arrived of British interference near Acre, and the Ottoman forces were reorganizing inland. But his most loyal aides noted a shift in him, not just a tactical focus or weariness, but a certain distance. He no longer ate in the company of others. He began washing his hands more often, using precious water rationed for the wounded. He instructed his personal tent to be fumigated with vinegar and herbs, a remedy passed down from older military texts. More symbolic than useful. He would not be undone by rats. And yet, at night, he woke in a sweat. The city, once a goal, had become a trap. To move forward meant exposure to more Ottoman resistance. To stay meant slow decay. But the idea of retreat, Napoleon hated that more than the disease. A surgeon named René Destinets began cataloging symptoms. He noted the spread, the behaviors, the days between first fever and final breath. He even considered an autopsy, but lacked both proper instruments and the stomach to cut, to play blackened flesh. Instead, he petitioned for mass evacuation. Napoleon refused at first, but when two of his personal messengers collapsed outside the command tent, foam at the mouth and with swollen groins, he paused. Jaffa had been taken, but the question now became, what had they truly won? And worse, how long before the rot that gnawed the city reached the empire's heart? Asterisk, Napoleon did not retreat. Not yet. To retreat would be to admit weakness. Decay. In weakness, especially the kind that came from sickness, from shadows and vermin and squalor, was a type of failure more damning than defeat on the battlefield. It could not be glorified in dispatches. There was no painting, no victory arch for dying slowly in a rat-infested house. Instead, he doubled down. Orders were given. Latrines were to be dug deeper and farther from the makeshift hospitals. Fatigue was to be poured liberally along walls and thresholds. Every soldier was required to wash their hands at least once per day, a comical demand in a region short on clean water. But one that carried the weight of discipline behind it. Des Senets, the army physician, found himself in an impossible position. He had neither the tools nor the trust to control the outbreak, and the more he tried to implement rudimentary medical procedures, the more he encountered military resistance. Sanitation was a matter of logistics, not life, in the army's view, and treating the sick. That was something for the rear, not the front. But the front and rear blurred in Jaffa. There were no clean lines anymore. The rats didn't distinguish between ranks or roles. They lived in the cracks of the command posts and the spaces beneath the cannons. The bit, cooks, and quartermasters, buglers, and generals. One morning, drummer boy was found dead beside his drum, his cheeks unusually sunken, his eyes wide and glassy. There was no wound. No blood, only the telltale purple lesions rising up. His inner thigh. Destinets knew what it was. Bubonic plague. Or something very close to it. He told Napoleon, quietly, without ceremony, and then he waited. It wasn't fear in Napoleon's eyes. It's not exactly. It's more like calculation. The same expression he wore when surveying maps of fortresses or enemy columns. This, too, was a siege. But the walls were built of flesh, and the enemy couldn't be routed. After a long silence, Napoleon asked, what can be done to halt it? Destinets said what few in his position would dare to say, nothing, except to leave. Napoleon looked out the tent's flap. In the distance, the pale roofs of Jaffa shimmered in the mid-morning heat. Somewhere beyond them, the British loomed like a rumor, and Ottoman reinforcements waited like a tide behind stone. But here, the bowels of a once busy port city, death had become predictable, rhythmic. 3 days, fever. 4 days, swelling. 5 days, death, and always the rats, ever present, twitching behind every sack of grain and every collapsed wall in desperation. The general permitted something that would later become a point of deep controversy: the burning of certain hospitals, not in cruelty, not in spite, but in dread. The sickest, those whose skin had already darkened, whose breath came in ragged, wet gasps, were given laudanum. The others were left. The buildings were locked, the shutters nailed shut. A torch was tossed, and for the next hour, the air above Jaffa carried something worse than the scent of disease. It carried silence, not screams, not cries, but a terrible, heavy silence, as if even pain had surrendered. Napoleon did not attend the burnings, nor did Desgenetz, but both recorded the moment in different ways. The general, in his orders, and in a single clipped entry in his campaign journal, as a physician, in haunted letters, never meant for public view. A few officers protested. Most did not. They were too busy guarding their own boots from nibbling teeth or shaking out their uniforms in hopes of crushing fleas. Because now, even the fleas were feared. A single bite, a single mark. That's all it took to be moved to the outer cot stew. Join the silent rows of men with swollen necks and blackened limbs. But even as sickness raged, life continued in absurd mechanical ways. Drills were held, cannons cleaned, horses fed and brushed, sentries posted, orders repeated. Soldiers marched through alleys, reeking of smoke and bile, their boots striking puddles that hissed with oil and infection. And, all the while, Napoleon waited for news from Acre, waited for word from France, waited to see if the rats would spare him. He slept in a different tent each night now, a precaution, or perhaps a superstition. He had become more meticulous about his meals, inspecting the bread for mold, the water for color, the wine for sourness. He demanded lavender sachets be placed near his bedrolls, not for comfort, but for the theory that the pleasant smell might ward off plague. He also carried his own eating utensils, refusing those provided by the camp. Men whispered about it, about how the general who charged across bridges under cannon fire, now feared spoons and stray cats. But the whispers were tinged with admiration. After all, he was still standing, still writing, still commanding. And then, one evening news came. A letter. A skiff had arrived, bearing urgent dispatches from the coast. A British blockade was tightening. Ottoman forces were organizing in greater number than expected. The Egyptian campaign had run its course. The Jaffa, chapter bloody, disease-ridden, Quan was coming to a close. But before leaving, Napoleon insisted on one final gesture. He called for a visit to the remaining hospital. This time, he would be seen not just touching the sick, but embracing them, a bold act of fearlessness. Some say he kissed a plague victim on the forehead. Others say it was a performance staged for morale. But Desgenetz was there, and in his journal, he wrote a single sentence. He did it without trembling. Still, what the gesture cost him inside is unknowable. He left the city within days. His army followed in stages, leaving behind ash, bones, and rats who no longer feared humans, and those who remained. A few French soldiers, too weak to travel, some locals who had never had the luxury of fleeing. The silence returned, but now it was not a pause before chaos. It was a silence filled with the slow decay of what had once been order. Jaffa's walls still stood, but its spirit had buckled, not from cannon, not from sword, but from fleas, from filth, from fear. As for Napoleon, he never spoke much of the rats. He rarely mentioned the plague, at least not in public, but privately, among his closest circle, when the conversation turned to the British. To Nelson, two political threats in Paris, he would pause, then quietly change the subject. Not to war, not to politics, but to cleanliness, to vinegar, to the importance of good drainage. Even an emperor can be haunted by vermin. Asterix, the last French boot to leave Jaffa, likely carried more than just sand. By late March of 1799, Napoleon's army had begun its movement northward, away from the city that had become both a prize and a punishment. The battered port, once imagined as a step toward imperial greatness, now stood as a grim reminder of how even victors can rot from within. The withdrawal wasn't publicized as a retreat. In the official bulletins, it was a strategic repositioning. In the minds of the surviving soldiers, however, it was salvation. What remained behind was not the usual trail of conquered order. Its clinics and schools and military improvements Napoleon fancied for places he deemed worthy of his legacy. Instead, what remained in Jaffa was the stench of hurried burial pits, scorched storehouses, and silence punctuated by the patter of small feet and the rats. They stayed by now. They had nested in the ruins of homes, churches, and cisterns. They ran unchallenged through the tunnels beneath the fortress, unbothered by the fragments of shell and musket ball. Whatever men had tried to control in this place, the rodents had inherited. There was nothing poetic about it, no symbolic irony, just biology, survival, teeth, and time. What mattered to Napoleon, the teeth, now was narrative control. He commissioned dispatches to be written that would explain the necessary mercy shown in dealing with plague victims, phrased carefully to avoid the truth of the hospital fires. He painted his visit to the sick as an act of courageous leadership. The famous image, later reproduced and mythologized, would show him touching the sores of the ill like a modern saint. In the final print, the rats were not shown, nor the smell, nor the locked shutters. Even Disgenette's role was softened. The physician who had argued against euthanasia was transformed in post-campaign propaganda into a loyal servant of strategic necessity. His own journals, while never published during his lifetime, told a more complex story, one of tension, of quiet protest, of moral compromise. As the army pushed toward Acre, the memory of Jaffa lingered in every soldier's cough. The field reports from the following weeks showed an unusual number of absences, not from battle wounds, but from fevers, boils, and intestinal agony. Some of the soldiers carried the sickness with them, others merely the memory. One lieutenant wrote home to his brother in Lyon, "I have seen men lose limbs to cannon, and I have seen them lose their minds to the scratching behind a wall. I know not which is worse." But Jaffa did something to Napoleon. The cannonballs had not. It made him more cautious not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of hygiene and health. From that point forward, his staff would notice a shift. Latrine placement became a subject of planning meetings. The health reports from regimental surgeons began to carry more weight. In camps, orders were given to burn soiled bedding more quickly, to control the movement of stray animals, and to inspect bread rations for evidence of infestation. In later campaigns, especially in the disastrous march into Russia, could see echoes of Jaffa in Napoleon's logistics. The focus on winter clothing, the distribution of vinegar, the attempts at medical oversight. However inadequate, they were seeds planted by pestilence and fear, not by strategy alone. And yet, despite all efforts, the memory of Jaffa's rats never left entirely. It wasn't just in military practices. It lived in his dreams. According to a valet's lighter writings, Napoleon was once found pacing in his tent outside Dresden, muttering in Corsican, wringing his hands as if drying them, even though they were not wet. When questioned, he dismissed it as a dream of a city full of black shapes. He rarely elaborated, but Disgenette's, when pressed in his final years, gave a quiet summary. He could command men, but he could not command microbes. That is, perhaps, the most chilling lesson from the entire affair. Empires rise on bold campaigns, and generals are judged by their victories. But the history that survives the boring kind is often shaped not by glory, by sewage, by vermin, by the logistical failures that breed catastrophe in silence. Jaffa was never forgotten by those who marched through it, not because of the fighting, which was brief and decisive, But because of what came after, what lingered under floorboards and behind the teeth of the feverish, for many, it was their first encounter with something truly beyond military control. Years later, as Napoleon sat in exile on the island of Elba, far removed from the grand theaters of war, he was asked by one of his remaining aides what he feared most during his conquests. The aide expected an answer like the Royal Navy or betrayal in Paris. Instead, the former emperor reportedly said, "The things that cannot be killed, with bullets, rats, fleas, the breath of dying men." Was it an exaggeration? Possibly. But among the endless catalogs of his battles and proclamations, it is that quiet, moment-reflective, offhanded, and painfully human that may have been the most honest. And so, Jaffa remained in the margins of history, not as a glorious victory, not as a defeat, but as something else entirely. A city conquered by France, surrendered to decay. It's a place where fear, war, whiskers, and the empire met its match, not in soldiers, but in squeaks and sores. A reminder that even emperors must one day answer to filth. And as we leave that narrow city on the Mediterranean, still warm under an indifferent sun, we must ask, was it the British Napoleon truly feared? Or was it the knowing silence beneath the floorboard? In Jaffa, by the time the sun had fully risen over the windswept plains near Austerlitz, Dominique Jean Larry had already amputated 3 arms and 1 leg. And it wasn't even 7 o'clock in the morning. There were no tents, no smooth surfaces, no antiseptics, just cold metal, warmer blood, to urgency. While Napoleon plotted maneuvers and repositioned artillery, Larry crouched behind a hay cart, soaked in old snow and fresh hemorrhage, elbow deep in a young corporal's thigh. The man had been struck by a ball that shattered the femur and driven fragments upward into the pelvis. A painful injury, a fatal one. Unless you had a surgeon like Larry. He moved quickly, quietly, the way he always did. His face remained strangely calm, almost detached, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The moment he paused to feel sorrow, another soldier might die. His assistants, mostly boys barely older than the patients themselves, had stopped reacting to the sight of torn flesh or severed fingers. Their job was to hold the limb still and pass the instruments fast. Sometimes they whispered prayers. Sometimes they just counted out loud to keep from fainting. Larry had long ago stopped praying during operations. He operated instead. He did not wear gloves. He could not afford to sterilize. He sharpened his blades against leather straps between procedures and occasionally wiped them on his apron when the next man approached. He could amputate a leg in under 2 minutes, and often did. What made him different was not only speed, but something rarer, compassion. He spoke to the men while he worked, not always kindly, but always with presence. Hold steady, you're going to make it. Think of home. Sometimes even, don't look at me, look at the sky. In that morning, the sky over Austerlitz was pale, blue, and distant almost. Mocking, by midday, Larry's mobile field hospital, a concept he had designed himself, had been set up along a ridge. It was not a hospital in the modern sense. It was a stretch of rough canvas and wagons, surrounded by splinters of crates and the stench of iron. He called them ambulances, Volantis flying ambulances, though they flew only in the sense that they moved swiftly across the battlefield, pulled by horses, bringing surgical care as close to the front as war would allow. Before Larry, wounded men were often left to crawl or be dragged from the field. By the time they reached medical help, if they reached it, was usually too late. Infection, shock, blood loss, shame. But Larry changed that. He didn't wait for permission. He built his own mobile units. He trained crews. He taught soldiers that wounds were not shameful. He demanded that the wounded be treated according to urgency, not rank. A general with a clean bullet through the shoulder waited behind a drummer boy with a crushed ankle. Always, Napoleon approved. More than that, he admired Larry. Not many men could earn the emperor's respect without flattery or fear, but Larry had done it by saving lives in silence. Still, admiration didn't prevent exhaustion. At Austerlitz, Larry worked for over 18 hours without sitting down. He slept, curled behind a barrel for just under 30 minutes, then resumed. The war did not pause for fatigue. Neither did infection. His journal, written hastily in spare moments, recorded statistics more than reflections. 74 amputations, 112 dressings, 28 deaths during surgery, 3 deaths after he counted, not because he lacked emotion, but because numbers helped him think. And in the fog of battle, precision was mercy. He had begun each day before sunrise and ended after nightfall, sometimes using a lantern wedged into a soldier's boot to light the next incision. His uniform, once crisp, was stiff with dried blood. By evening, he stopped noticing the smell long ago. It wasn't just the surgeries. It was the walking. Larry walked 4 miles each day across hills, between outposts, back and forth from the dead to the nearly dead. He assessed which men could be saved and which ones could not. And though he never hesitated in his duty, the decisions weighed on him. He would kneel beside a groaning soldier, lift the man's shirt, and inspect the wound. If the abdomen was hard and the breathing shallow, he might nod once and say nothing. Move on. There was no medicine for internal bleeding. Not then. At times, he found men who begged to be put out of their misery. He refused. "I am here to help," he'd whisper. He never carried a pistol, not because he was a pacifist, but because he refused to participate in death. And still, death sat beside him every hour. Like an impatient colleague, his assistants often struggled more than he did. They vomited. They panicked. One fainted during a sawing procedure and had to be dragged aside by Larry himself, who then finished the operation one-handed while keeping the man alive with the other. He was always calm, always quick, but never cold. Even the most hardened grenadiers noticed it. They would later say, "He looked into your eyes even when your leg was gone, and you felt like a man, not a mess." By late evening, when the main fighting had moved past the ridge, Larry still operated. The wind picked up. The lanterns flickered. The rats arrived. Not the plague-bearing horde of Jaffa, but the battlefield rats, the ones that followed armies from camp to camp, nibbling at the edges of uniforms and corpses alike. He kicked one aside absent-mindedly as he removed a musket ball from a man's rib cage. He could hear singing from a nearby, perhaps victory chants, but he didn't look up. His hands moved with memory now, not sight. He could perform a simple amputation without speaking, without thinking, with the rhythm of a craftsman who has shaped wood all his life. But he was not shaping wood. He was reshaping men, what was left of them. One of the final patients that night was a young officer with both legs crushed beneath a fallen horse. There was no saving either limb. Larry amputated both, one after the other. When it was done, he sat beside the man for a full 5 minutes, not to monitor vitals, not to assess the wound, but to sit, just to be there, human to human. The soldier, barely conscious, whispered something. Larry didn't catch it, but he nodded anyway. And then, without ceremony, he stood, dipped his hands in a basin of red water, and turned toward the next stretcher. Tomorrow would be worse. It always was. But tonight, he would sleep, maybe, with his boots still on. The sound of rats in a straw. What did Larry fear more than blood, more than exhaustion, more than pain itself? And how many lives could one man save before he forgot his own name? Asterisk, the war moved forward, always forward. But Dominique Jean Larry, the surgeon who walked behind it, carried its weight in blood-soaked linen and scribbled names on paper scraps no one else would ever read again. By the time the Grande Armée crossed into Prussia, the bodies were colder. Not just in temperature, but in the way they died faster, less dramatic, almost routine. An act, the French victories stacked up, but so did the wounded. And so did the paperwork, because Larry wasn't just a surgeon. He was a recorder, a manager, custodian of the broken. After each battle, he compiled lists, names, injuries, procedures, fates. He insisted on documenting everything, whether a man had lost his foot or 3 fingers, whether he died from gangrene or survived with an iron plate inserted in his skull. This wasn't for promotion or publication. It was for order, for memory. But memory was fragile, and so were the records. One night, while camped near Eylau in the bitter winter of 1807, Larry awoke to find that a canvas card carrying 2 weeks' worth of surgical reports had been gnawed through by mice and ruined by snow. He stood in the dark, holding the dripping papers in his hands, staring as the ink bled into illegibility. Names disappeared before his eyes, as if the men themselves had been erased. He did not yell, he did not curse. He simply sat beside the cart and began rewriting what he could remember from scratch, by firelight, till morning. That was Larry's other war. The one fought not with sabers or syringes, but with time, against forgetfulness, against the way armies turned people into statistics. He wanted them to be remembered, even the ones who died screaming, especially the ones who died quietly. But caring had its cost. The French military bureaucracy, still full of old-world administrators who preferred numbers to faces, began questioning his methods. Why were so many supplies being used on men unlikely to fight again? Why did the field hospitals require so many horses? Was there any need to treat enemy wounded with the same urgency as French soldiers? Larry's answers never changed. Because life mattered. Because mercy mattered. Because even in war, a surgeon does not choose who to save. He refused to prioritize nobility. He once treated a dying Polish farmer who'd stumbled into the warpath with the same attention he gave to marshals. His reasoning was blunt. Pain has no uniform, and still he did not sleep. In the few hours he stole for rest, he often did so under wagons, or in the corner of barns, or slumped against the wall of a bakery that still smelled faintly of bread despite the shattered beams above. He kept a knife tucked into his boot knot for protection, to slice bandages in a hurry. There was always someone moaning, always someone calling for water, or their mother, or God. One of the most grueling days came not during battle, but during retreat. After the failed campaign in Russia, Larry was left with more wounded than space. The snow had returned, and with it, frostbite. Amputations were no longer from cannonballs, but from the cold. Men lost noses, ears, toes, entire feet, blackened, numb, useless. Some begged for the knife. Others screamed until their throats cracked. Larry's tools froze solid. He had to warm his saws over fires before cutting. Times they smoked as they touched flesh. In Smolensk, he operated in a burnt-out church. The altar had been smashed, the stained glass shattered. He laid men on the stone floor where the pews had been, using fragments of uniforms for pillows. The walls echoed with prayer, or maybe just pain. There was no difference anymore. And yet, through all this, Larry refused to lose his humanity. He made jokes, dark ones, sometimes, but meant to distract. He handed candies to children who'd lost parents. He instructed his orderlies to sing when washing wounds, so the soldiers would focus on the tune instead of the sting. And still, his notes piled up. Every name, every wound, every death. He wrote of a boy no older than 15, found in a ditch, with his hands frostbitten and curled like claws. He saved one hand, lost the other. The boy kissed Larry's sleeve as he woke from the surgery. Larry cried. For the first time in weeks, but there was no time to stop. Another man waited. Another after that. Napoleon's army collapsed inward like a broken lung. Thousands died, not from battle, but from exposure. And those who lived did so with half their limbs and haunted eyes. Through it all, Larry remained. It was said he was the last Frenchman to cross the Berezina River, carrying 2 wounded men on his back. When the officers insisted he flee, he replied, "I will go when they go." He nearly froze to death that night, but he did because duty, like infection, had seeped too far into his blood to be purged. By the time he returned to France, Larry was no longer just a surgeon. He was a relic of something nobler than victory, integrity. He declined medals. He refused promotions that would remove him from the field. He asked only for better bandages and more wagons. What did he fear? Not death, not even dismemberment, but bureaucracy, the quiet killing of good men by paperwork, the denial of care based on budget, turning away of a soldier because his uniform was torn in the wrong place or his name misspelled on a roster. Larry fought against all of that with his pen, with his saw, with his silence. And still, in the end, he was just one man against an empire's endless march. So we are left to ask, what happens when mercy itself becomes a burden? In the final years of Napoleon's campaigns, Dominique Jean Larry found himself working not just as a surgeon of the body, but as a kind of surgeon of memory, suturing together what remained of men, of morale, and of meaning. By 1814, the Grande Army no longer resembled the proud force that had crossed Europe in precise, disciplined waves. It was threadbare, ragged, disillusioned. Veterans marched beside boys who had never fired a musket. Horses limped. Boots split. Officers spoke softly, if at all. And Larry, still moving among them like a ghost with bandages, remained as steady as ever. He was older now, grayer. His hands, once famed for their speed and surety, bore scars not just from slipped blades or shattered bone, but from frostbite and exhaustion. He wore gloves sometimes when supplies allowed, but more often he worked barehanded, trusting instinct over comfort. At the siege of Paris in 1814, as the coalition forces closed in on Napoleon's empire, Larry worked from a makeshift hospital, set up inside an abandoned printing press. The walls still smelled faintly of ink and burnt paper. The presses had been turned into operating tables. Type trays now held scalpels and bandages. Here, amid the slow collapse of a dream, Larry continued his routine. Wake before light, dress wounds, amputate limbs, count the dead, record the living. Every morning, he wiped his instruments clean, not sterilized. There were no such practices yet, but cleaned, methodically, as if ritual could stave off mortality. And the soldiers still trusted him, even when they no longer trusted France. It wasn't just because he had saved them. It was because he had never lied to them. He never promised survival. He never glamorized their wounds. He simply worked, silently, steadily, always there. One morning, a colonel bleeding heavily from a cannon fragment to the hip refused any other surgeon. "I'll wait for Larry," he gasped. He did, and Larry saved him. Not because he had the finest tools, but because he had the calm, the presence, the hands that never shook. The surgeon had developed a method of operating even in complete chaos. During artillery bombardments, he would crouch in stairwells or behind church altars, using whatever light he could find. Sometimes a candle wedged into a musket barrel. Sometimes moonlight bouncing off snow. Once, during a retreat, he operated while riding in a cart, his knees locking the patient in place as he stitched a gash across a soldier's abdomen. The wound reopened weeks later, but the man lived long enough to walk again. Larry did not speak of such moments with pride. He barely mentioned them at all. His journals, still meticulous, were filled with facts, not feelings, a tight me. But between the lines, the weight of what he had seen lingered like a fever. He had operated on children who had lied about their age to enlist, on women disguised as men, on civilians caught in crossfire, on horses, dogs, anything that breathed and suffered. His fame grew, though he never chased it. Other generals admired him. Foreign officers wrote about him with reluctant awe, even enemy. Surgeons requested to meet him when truces allowed. During the brief peace following Napoleon's abdication, Larry was treated like a visiting scholar in Vienna, Berlin, and Prague, but he never adjusted to peace. There were no wounds to treat, no urgency, no purpose. He wandered hospitals, offering advice. He helped reorganize French military medical schools, but the silence of peacetime unsettled him until war returned. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba. The 100 Days began, and so did Larry's final campaign. He followed the army to Waterloo not out of loyalty to politics, but loyalty to people. The Battle of Waterloo was chaos. Mud, smoke, miscommunication, carnage. There were too many wounded and too few wagons. The ambulances volantes could not maneuver through the sodden fields. Larry improvised, turned overturned carts into triage stations, commandeered wheelbarrows. He operated by moonlight once more, and still he did not stop. Even as the French lines collapsed, even as retreat became rout, he was captured by Prussian soldiers in the aftermath. Some wanted to execute him, but one officer recognized his name. Larry had once treated his cousin, an enemy soldier, without hesitation. The Prussians spared him. In the years that followed, Larry faded from public life. Napoleon was exiled again. The empire crumbled. Maps were redrawn, but in small towns across France, in taverns and parishes and alleyways, old soldiers spoke of the man who never slept, the man who gave them back what little dignity the war had not already taken. He died in 1842, peacefully, finally, at rest. In his will, he asked for no monuments, no statues, just a grave near those he had served. And so we remember him not with fanfare, but with something rarer, gratitude for every hand he held, every leg he cut cleanly to save a life, every whispered, "You'll make it," even when he knew it wasn't true. We remember him in silence, in the steady rhythm of a knife drawn through bandage, in the dark corner of a ruined church where mercy once crouched beside suffering, because Dominique Jean Larry didn't fear the battlefield. He feared being unable to help, and in the end, what greater legacy is there than a hand that never stopped trying? Asterisk, you rarely hear their names in history books. You never see them in paintings. But in the early summer of 1800, in the wooded hills of northern Italy, a small team of French soldiers, wielding nothing but spades, buckets, and long poles, may have saved an entire campaign. They were not grenadiers. They were not drummers. They were the latrine crew, their official title, being the endless roll of military bureaucratic language, was something like sanitary logistics, auxiliary detachment. But among the men of the French army, they had another name, the Holdigers. Napoleon never wrote about them, but he needed them, because in 1800, as the French army crossed the Alps into Italy in preparation for the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon's greatest risk wasn't a flanking maneuver or an ambush. It was dysentery the previous year. Over 6,000 soldiers had been lost, not in battle, but to bowel disease. Entire battalions had been reduced to moaning clusters of dehydrated men lying in fields, their strength leaking out of them hour by hour. The cause was simple and stupid: bad water, bad hygiene, bad planning. The fix was less glorious, less poetic, and infinitely more important. The latrine crew was tasked with building a waste system on the move. They were not trained medics. They were not volunteers. Most had been punished with the assignment after. Minor infractions, stealing rations, mouthing off to a sergeant, being drunk during morning roll call. But what had begun as punishment soon became purpose. Their leader was a former cooper named Ailing DeVoe. He had once made barrels in Marseille, then enlisted during the Revolution. After getting caught hoarding cheese and lying, he was reassigned to the sanitation detail. He took the job seriously. By the time Napoleon's army reached the Alpine foothills, DeVoe had developed an entire code of waste management. He taught his crew how to dig pit latrines in clay versus shale, how to angle trench lines away from camp kitchens, how to construct wind baffles out of broken fence boards, and how to mark contaminated areas with chalk symbols. They carried shovels like weapons. They wore scarves over their faces. They traveled ahead of the main body of troops, identifying campsites and calculating where latrines should go. No one saluted them. Most men avoided them entirely. But when dysentery broke out in a cavalry unit near Navarra, it was DeVoe and his men who contained it. They isolated the area, dug fresh trenches, burned the soiled bedding. They even carted buckets of lime from a nearby abandoned farm and dusted the latrines to mask the smell and reduce flies. Within a week, the outbreak was halted. That unit remained combat ready. Other armies might have ignored the event, let it pass, lost 200 men, and kept moving. But Napoleon was different. He didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to control the variables. And so, when word of the latrine crew's quick action reached one of his medical aides, a brief note was scribbled in a supply ledger. DeVoe knows his work. No reward, no medal, just acknowledgement, but it mattered. In the weeks leading up to Marengo, the crew's responsibilities expanded. They were now tasked with managing latrines for the general staff as well, including for officers who had never once dug a trench in their lives. DeVoe remained quiet. He didn't care who used the holes, only that they were used properly. He once scolded a brigadier for relieving himself too close to the mess tent. The brigadier threatened him. DeVoe didn't flinch. He said, "Sir, I'm the reason you can eat and fight in the same day. Kindly squat where I told you." Word of the exchange circulated. Napoleon heard about it, laughed, and later, when asked if DeVoe should be punished, supposedly replied, "Promote him. He saved your appetite." Asterisk by now. The latrine crew had grown from a dozen to nearly 40 men. They constructed makeshift urinals from musket barrels driven into soil. They mapped wind direction for stink control. They even began building rudimentary hand-washing stations, buckets, on sticks with small drainage channels dug beneath. No one said thank you. But more and more men began to take their advice seriously as the Battle of Marengo approached, with thousands of French troops bivouacked in tight spaces across warm summer fields. It became clear that sanitation could decide the outcome, because if the army fell sick, even a perfect tactical plan wouldn't matter. And there was another risk: the drinking water. The latrine crew identified 3 contaminated wells and 2 streams that had become fouled by animal carcasses. They marked them with wooden stakes and painted skulls on signs. Using pig's blood and ashdot, they tested new water by watching how frogs reacted. If the frogs stayed, it was probably safe. If the frogs avoided it, well, then it wasn't water, it was slow poison. DeVoe even began carrying a ledger of safe water points, which he passed to quartermasters. It wasn't official. No one told him to do it, but he did it anyway. And then, June 14th, 1800, Marengo exploded. The Austrians attacked before noon. The French were caught off guard. The lines broke. The battlefield turned to chaos. Horses screamed. Men fell. But amid the thunder of cannon and the screams of wounded men, DeVoe and his team did not run. They pivoted. Where before they had dug trenches, now they dug evacuation channels. They turned latrines into water control pits to keep runoff from reaching the medical wagons. They helped carry the wounded not because they were ordered to, but because They saw no other option. And when the tide turned, when the French counterattacked and drove the Austrians back, it was not just the grenadiers who cheered. It was the latrine crew too, because they had done something extraordinary. They had kept the army upright, while others spoke of glory. They had held back rot, and the truth, boring as it is that no empire can function without men like Devoe, because battles may be won by force, but campaigns are won by those who make sure the army can eat us and relieve itself without dying. And so we must ask, what if the most important man at Marengo wasn't Napoleon, but the barrel maker with a shovel and a quiet understanding of waste? Asterisk, when the smoke cleared over Marengo and the battlefield lay silent, except for the crows, there were bodies, of course, dozens of them, scattered across wheat fields and vine-covered ridges. But also, there were still standing rows of trenches, properly dug and covered, dry and marked, dug by men whose names wouldn't appear in dispatches. Latrine crew had not just survived the battle, they had expanded their role during it. By dusk, while the army sorted the wounded and carried away the dead, the crew resumed their unglamorous work. They dug new waste pits farther from the water lines, filled in the older ones with ash and earth, and scraped a thick paste of vinegar and lime into the remaining shallow holes to prevent the rise of flies. One young grenadier, half drunk and caked in powder, passed them and shouted, "That's the worst job in the world." Devoe didn't look up. He just said, "That's why we get it done first." The logic was simple. A bad latrine today meant a dead army tomorrow. The connection between sanitation and survival wasn't just theory anymore, it was demonstrated fact. Marengo had proven that, because here's what hadn't happened. There had been no major outbreak of dysentery, no waterborne plague, no sudden collapse of unit strength due to mass illness. That alone made the victory sustainable. After the battle, Napoleon ordered his army to hold position for several days. Supplies needed to be restocked, wounded, transported, communications re-established. During that pause, while generals reviewed maps and rearranged corps, Devoe submitted something strange, a hand-drawn layout of optimal camp sanitation infrastructure, complete with elevations, pit placements, waste distance ratios, and lime distribution estimates. He had sketched it on the back of a requisition form. It passed from one 80 camp to another, eventually making its way to Marshal Berthier, who passed it along to Napoleon. Napoleon read it, said nothing, but then handed it back and said, "This man is thinking like a general." Devoe was summoned not for punishment or reassignment, but for conversation. No official record survives of what was said in that tent. But what is known is that shortly after, a formal sanitation unit was created, and Devoe was promoted to oversee its training. His latrine crew, once considered a side assignment for discipline cases, became a cornerstone of the Army's health doctrine. They were no longer just diggers. Keyed, they were preventers of death. Devoe trained men in each regiment on the essentials. How to dig a trench with the slope of the land in mind, how to prevent seepage into food stores, how to identify safe distances between water and waste, how to construct drainage with available materials. Built what we might call today a curriculum. But it wasn't theory. It was shaped by experience, by the difference between a camp that stayed standing and one that vomited itself into collapse. He also began insisting on something radical. Dignity. The Army's latrines had long been crude, shallow holes with no privacy, no separation by rank, and no respect for modesty. This had created predictable problems. Officers refused to use them. Some soldiers would rather risk illness than humiliation. Devoe pushed for better. He encouraged canvas screens, individual dugouts for higher ranks, and even basic seat frames made from discarded wood. Not comfort compliance, 'cause if the men wouldn't use the holes, all the digging in the world was pointless. Some officers scoffed, but others saw the benefit. When men used latrines instead of relieving themselves near camp, illness dropped. Morale, paradoxically, improved. There was less shame, less stench, less disease. He even experimented with scent control, crushing mint leaves and mixing them into the lime used in waste pits. A few men thought it superstitious, but others started calling his camp areas DeVoe Gardens. There was humor in it, but also truth, because the latrine crew now had a reputation not just as ditch diggers, but as the reason the army could keep marching. In early 1801, during a secondary campaign through Tuscany, a French division bivouacked for 5 nights in a marshy area outside Arezzo. Rain flooded the region. The mud was ankle-deep. Campfires sputtered out in puddles. Conditions were perfect for an outbreak, and yet nothing spread. Why? Because Devo and his crew had preemptively constructed elevated waste platforms, planks, laid over trenches with angled grooves to direct runoff and a daily covering of dry ash to absorb fluid. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Even the medics, often dismissive of the latrine detail, began coordinating with him directly when a unit surgeon complained of fly outbreaks near his infirmary tent. Devo simply moved the nearest trench, adjusted the drainage line, and placed fresh mint ash. The flies left within hours. One soldier joked, "He's not a Cooper anymore. He's a doctor of dirt." By now, he'd stopped caring what they called him, as long as they used the trenches. He began keeping a new journal, not of people, but of holes. He documented each latrine: depth, soil, composition, wind, direction, location, relative to water, how long it took before the smell became intolerable. What covered it best it was, in its own way, a record of survival. Because every trench that didn't poison the men extended the army's lifespan. It's hard to grasp the scale of what he prevented. Dysentery kills quietly. It doesn't make headlines. There are no bayonets, no victories to report, just dehydration, muscle collapse, death in the night. But because Devo had paid attention not to strategy, but to the ordinary functions of the human body, entire force had stayed on its feet. And this, in turn, allowed Napoleon to campaign farther, faster, and more efficiently than many of his enemies. So we ask ourselves again, who truly holds up an empire? Is it the man on horseback with a telescope? Or the man with a shovel who understands that even armies must relieve themselves? Asterisk. By the end of 1801, Alan DeVoe and his sanitation crew had dug over 2,000 latrines across Italy, Switzerland, and parts of southern Germany. Some were basic trench cuts, others resembled makeshift outhouses. All of them were temporarily used, filled, covered, and abandoned like footprints in the mud of forgotten marches. None of them exist today. Not a single trench remains. Not one wooden frame or vinegar-lined pit. Time swallowed them, as it does all things not built of stone or recorded in bronze. But for a brief, vital moment in Napoleon's vast and restless empire, Devil's crew may have been the quiet difference between advancement and collapse. Their work was never glorious. It was often humiliating. The smell followed them everywhere. Their uniforms were stained with lime and worse. Other soldiers avoided them in camp. Tavern keepers near French encampments would often charge them double, simply for what they represented. Yet, among the medics, quartermasters, and officers who actually paid attention, they were treated with a quiet, grudging respect. When a typhoid outbreak struck a Spanish regiment in late 1802 and was prevented from spreading due to a well-marked waste perimeter installed by DeVoe's team the week prior, the local commander sent a sealed letter to the Ministry of War recommending formal commendation for Les Hommes de Lombard, the men of the shadow. Nothing came of it. Recognition, when it arrived, came informally. A field surgeon gave them fresh gloves. A commissary shared salted pork meant for officers. Napoleon, passing through a camp in Verona, stopped briefly to review one of DeVoe's sanitation maps and asked, Why are there no flies here? Devo, standing beside his canvas plan, answered simply, because we arrived first, sir. It is the only recorded exchange between the two men. Later that year, Devo collapsed while digging a pit outside Parma. Not from injury, it's from fatigue. Asterisk. He'd worked 19 consecutive days without rest, overseeing a growing network of sanitation camps and traveling between units to provide inspections. He was carried to a barn and nursed for 5 days by medics he'd helped. During earlier outbreaks, when he returned to duty, he worked more slowly. The cold had stiffened his joints, and he began using a carved walking stick made from a splintered rifle stock. But he refused to stop, refused to delegate too much. He would bend over trenches, cane in one hand, shovel in the other, whispering measurements like prayers. One young recruit once asked him why he took it so seriously. Devo looked up from the pit and said, because if we don't, men die. Not in battle, in silence. That silence haunted him. He'd seen soldiers expire from dysentery in the night, too weak to call for help. Seen burials carried out before dawn, the bodies so light from dehydration they barely weighed more than their coats. He hated those deaths, most of all the ones no one noticed, so he kept digging. He never held a sword. He never earned a medal. He never climbed higher than a junior quartermaster's rank, but he kept men on their feet, kept bread from being fouled by runoff, kept water clear, kept generals from commanding empty camps. And when he died of pneumonia during a spring downpour outside Mantua, his body was buried not in the military cemetery, but in one of the very pits he dug for waste, not out of disrespect, but because the army had already moved on, and there was no time to find other ground. A fellow crewman marked the grave with an old bayonet stuck blade down into the soil. Nothing was written. Nothing was recorded, just a hole in the earth. As always, decades later, when former officers reminisced about the victories of Napoleon's Italian campaigns, they spoke of tactics, valor, cavalry, maneuvers, but a few quiet ones would raise a glass and say, "Don't forget the man who dug the trenches. Without him, we'd all have died squatting behind a cart." And that may be the closest thing to a eulogy Olaine Devo ever received. So let us remember him not as a hero, but as a man who understood something most leaders never grasp, that empires fall not just by sword or rebellion, but by a single, filthy latrine too close to a well. He understood that sanitation is survival, that survival is success, and that success sometimes smells like vinegar and mint in earth, and we, who sleep comfortably today, forget too easily that clean water, orderly waste, and invisible laborers built the conditions for every victory we've ever known. So tonight, as we close this story, ask yourself, if you had to hold up a crumbling empire with only a shovel, would you know where to dig? Asterisk, at the height of his power, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled millions of lives with the stroke of a pen. But for every proclamation he issued and every military report he devoured, there were other documents, quieter, smaller, unglamorous, that moved far more slowly through the arteries of empire letters. They piled up in leather satchels, or bundled with string, stamped with wax, and entrusted to couriers whose horses limped across frostbitten mountains and sun-choked valleys. Many arrived late. Some never arrived at all. And within those lost pages were stories of love, betrayal, requests for clemency, and desperate calls for help. These were not letters of command, but of appeal. Letters that Napoleon, for all his might, often never saw. Some were addressed to him directly, others to ministers, aides, marshals, but many bore one simple salutation at the top, to the Emperor of the French. In 1806, the Imperial Mail Office in Paris received more than 12,000 such letters in a single quarter. Most came from soldiers, families, widows, provincial mayors, former revolutionaries who had fallen out of favor, farmers seeking compensation after their livestock were requisitioned by passing troops. They were sorted by low-level clerks, working in rooms thick with smoke and ink dust. The desks were warped, the pens dull, the paper coarse. They had no filing system worthy of the name, just wooden trays labeled to be reviewed, to be replied, and discarded. Sometimes, letters were read only once, sometimes not at all. Those marked for escalation would be copied by hand-heirs and all-end, passed up through administrative tiers, from a clerk to a secretary, from secretary to minister, and if it survived that far, perhaps onto the emperor's table. But Napoleon did not read them all, could not. He read summaries, abstracts, aide-prepared notes, but the letters themselves, whole, unedited, he rarely saw, and so whole lives were forgotten by accident. Consider the case of Claude Michel Fournier, a veteran of the Italian campaign. He wrote from Lyon in 1805. He had lost his leg at Rivali and had been promised a small pension, but the payments had stopped. He wrote in neat cursive that he was now surviving by making buttons from horn and was about to lose his home. His letter was placed in the to-be-reviewed pile. It stayed there. A clerk annotated it. Pension already processed under Decree 11/18. It was never sent to Napoleon. Fournier died 4 months later. His landlord sold his uniform at auction. His story was not unique. Thousands of similar appeals were buried in wooden crates, forgotten under stairwells, or chewed by rats behind the walls of underfunded prefecture buildings. Napoleon, for his part, believed himself to be a man of justice. He once declared, "Every citizen shall have the right to be heard by his emperor." But he was also a man of systems, and the system he created could not keep up with the demands of a restless population. The bureaucracy ballooned. The paper grew heavier, and regret was measured not in tears, but in unopened mail. Some letters were tragic. A wife pleading for news of her husband, missing after Austerlitz. Some were desperate. A village begging for bread after a poor harvest. One was simply signed by a child, who wrote, "Sir, please let my father come home now. We miss him." It was never answered. The clerk wrote, "Illegible. Archive." But not. All the fault lay in Paris. Regional. Postmasters, many appointed for political loyalty rather than skill, were often overwhelmed or indifferent. In Marseille, a warehouse full of unopened letters was discovered after the empire fell. Some dated 6 years earlier. Among them were multiple petitions from Jewish communities seeking protection against local persecution. Had they been seen, they might have prompted reform, but they weren't. And this, perhaps, is where history becomes most quietly brewed, and not in the violence of wars or the thunder of revolutions, but in the forgotten intentions, the words never heard, the bureaucratic machinery that ground empathy into compost. A few attempts were made to fix the system. In 1808, Napoleon created a correspondence review bureau, a kind of pre-modern customer service department. It was staffed by legal students and failed writers, tasked with distilling complex emotional appeals into clean, policy-ready summaries. But these summaries stripped away the soul. A letter that once read, asterisk, "My husband fought for the Republic. Now I starve," became subject requests, pension reconsideration due to prior service undocumented. Even when Napoleon signed off on a handful of these appeals, the human shape of the original was gone, and so he believed he was merciful. But the mercy was abstract. He knew the pain existed. He just didn't smell it, didn't touch the paper, still faintly marked with kitchen grease and tears. One clerk, named Etienne Roux, tried to change this. He kept a private bundle of the most moving letters he read, even those marked for discard. He called them Les Pleurs, the weepings. He read them aloud to himself in the evenings. Sometimes he added flourishes to the margins. One has poetry in it. He once wrote beside a letter from a seamstress in Amiens. He never met the emperor. He died of typhus in 1811. His bundle of weepings was never found, but historians later uncovered fragments, sentences on torn paper, bits of envelopes. A woman wrote, "Tell him we remember his promise." A man wrote, "If my son dies, in the emperor's name, let it be known." It is tempting to believe Napoleon would have acted differently had he read them all. That his will, so strong in battle, might have bent toward the humble requests of his people. But no man, no matter how brilliant, can outthink a mountain of unsorted grief. And so, these letters remained ghosts, unread, unanswered, unfiled, and in this, see the shadow of all great administrations, the moment when intent is severed from action, not by evil, but by excess. So, as we imagine Napoleon's hand-signing edicts with elegant flourish, we must also imagine the ink-stained fingers of clerks in dim offices, deciding silently whose suffering was too messy to matter, and we're left to wonder how different might history have been if someone had simply opened one more envelope. Asterisk. By 1810, the paper used in the imperial correspondence offices had changed, so it was cheaper now thinner, prone to tearing, sometimes bearing faint traces of reused parchment beneath the surface. Officials said it was for efficiency, but to the clerks who sorted through thousands of personal letters every week, it was one more sign that the empire was outgrowing its ability to feel. The letters kept coming, more than ever. Asterisk. Now that the Napoleonic Wars had reached across the continent, from the Iberian Peninsula to the banks of the Danube beds, French imperial machine carried not only taxes and troops, but also broken families, missing sons, and requests from all corners of Europe. And each week, cards arrived at the Bureau de la Correspondance, civilly, spilling sacks of letters into the narrow, ink-smelling hallways of buildings not built to handle this kind of weight. The clerks had grown numb. Some wore gloves, not for ink, but to keep from touching too much of other people's grief. They sorted by instinct: war, widow, pension claim, request for exemption, denunciation, anonymous plea. Every now and then, something broke through the routine. One morning, a letter arrived from Vilnius, was written in Polish, translated awkwardly by a junior scribe. K described a missing brother conscripted into the Grande Armée during the invasion of Russia. The family hadn't heard from him in nearly 2 years. The sister wrote, "We do not want compensation. We want to know where his bones lie, so we may speak to the earth." The translation was annotated. No action. Archive. It wasn't cruelty, it was capacity. The empire was running out of clerks, despite Napoleon's insistence on order. His government had created a paradox. The more territory it claimed, the less it could hear. Voices from Spain, Italy, Bavaria, Poland, and even parts of Egypt had to pass through narrow funnels of language. Censorship, and ranked one entire month's worth of letters from a provincial prefecture in Auvergne, was found burned in a stove. The clerk had decided it was better to remove them than fall behind. Meanwhile, the emperor still believed the system functioned. He met with ministers who gave him tallies, not testimonials. They showed him charts of resolved petitions, summarized statistics about successful pension dispersals. But he never smelled the mildew on the envelopes, never saw the misspellings of the barely literate, never felt the panic behind the careful ink strokes. His belief in the system was based on data. The system's failure was based on detail. Take, for example, the tragic loop of Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Merlot, wounded in Spain. Key was mistakenly declared dead and removed from the payroll. He returned home to find his wife remarried and his home confiscated. Key wrote 12 letters to the Ministry of War, each more desperate than the last. His fourth was returned, unopened, marked "Case Closed." His seventh letter read, "If I am a ghost, at least give me the dignity of haunting someone in charge." It was forwarded to the wrong office. Lost. He died in 1812, drunk and freezing on the steps of a parish infirmary. No one ever corrected the record. Sometimes, the letters themselves tried to resist. A few petitioners wrote in rhyme, thinking it would catch attention. Others added small gifts buttons, pressed flowers, coins. One desperate man from Corsica included a dead lizard wrapped in cloth, explaining it was a charm meant to ward off war. It was discarded with a notation, "Unhygienic, destroy." Even among the clerks, there were cracks. Etienne Roux, the junior scribe who once called his saved bundle Les Pleurs, was not alone in his sentimentality. Others began copying letters that struck them and passing them secretly to high-ranking friends, hoping that sympathy could leap over the walls of bureaucracy like fire across dry wheat. Some reached the ministers. One widow's plea for housing reached the desk of Joseph Fouch, Minister of Police, who forwarded it with the words, "Unusual dignity. Consider." She was granted a stipend, but most attempts failed. The volume was simply too great. In 1811 alone, more than 80,000 civilian letters arrived in Paris addressed to imperial officials. Only a fraction were ever opened, and this was not just a French problem. In Rome, letters to the imperial governor were stacked so high that rats nested inside the bottom layers. In Milan, a courier was caught selling unopened letters for scrap. In Brussels, a town official used sealed envelopes as insulation in his attic. And through all of this, Napoleon continued to govern as though the voice of the people still reached him. He issued reforms, pensions, edicts for infrastructure and charity. He believed he was benevolent, but what he saw was the version of reality sent through official channels, filtered, condensed, formalized, not the one whispered by exhausted mothers or written shakily by half-blind veterans asking for a loaf of bread or a warm coat. During one of his rare reviews of actual letters brought to him by a newly appointed aide, eager to impress, he reportedly spent several minutes reading a note from a washerwoman whose son had died in Austria. The letter read, "I know he is gone, but I cannot stop looking at the road. Please let me stop looking." Napoleon paused, said nothing, then told the aide to send something, but no address was given, no last name. The letter had no return path. It was filed away in a drawer beneath half a dozen others and forgotten. So, what does this tell us? It's that even the greatest leaders, the ones whose faces are carved into history, depend not on their intent, but on the willingness of the world to carry words without distortion. And sometimes the world cannot. Sometimes paper tears, ink fades, clerks die, and letters lie unopened in the dark dot. So tonight, as we imagine the thunder of hooves, the shining buttons on an officer's coat, and the echo of orders shouted in marble halls, remember also the quietest battle of all, the one fought between a hand desperate to be heard and a desk too full to notice. And ask yourself, how many destinies were changed not by war, but by a letter that arrived one day too late. Asterisk, by 1813, Napoleon's empire had begun to unravel, not only on battlefields, but in offices. The war in Russia had devoured men and morale. Revolts simmered in Spain. Austria and Prussia were growing bold again. And back in Paris, beneath all the flags and decrees, the shelves groaned under the weight of unread letters. The post rooms no longer smelled of ink alone. They smelled of mildew and candle smoke and the sour fatigue of men who knew their work would never be done. One clerk named Morath, 37 years old, with lungs weakened by decades of coal stoves, spent his last months sorting bundles labeled to be handled after the campaign. He would joke, "Whose campaign? ours or God's. He died of pneumonia in early December, slumped over a sheaf of petitions from the mothers of Alsace. No one noticed for nearly a day. When they found him, a letter was still gripped in his ink-stained hand. It was addressed not to Napoleon, not to any minister, but simply to someone who cares. That letter was placed in a box marked miscellaneous. The box was never opened again. By now, the bureaucratic decay had become visible. Ink shortages led to illegible replies. Some clerks began reusing parchments, scraping old letters clean with knives to make room for new ones. Entire sentences disappeared. Requests were overwritten, meaning blurred. And still, the letters came. From Spain, reports of destroyed farms, stolen livestock, pleas to spare the last sons of widows. From Germany, petitions for school funding, replacement teachers, lost apprentices. From Corsica, cousins of cousins asking for jobs, land, wine. It was not the content that overwhelmed. It was the weight of being needed by everyone Napoleon had. Wanted to be the father of modern France. But the father figure couldn't hear his children. There were too many. They spoke too softly, and the walls around him were thick with velvet, paper, and pride. The emperor still believed in paperwork. He famously said, "An order poorly written is an order poorly obeyed." But what about orders never written at all, Ken? What about voices? Never answered. One rare exception came in late 1813, when a courier personally handed Napoleon a letter from a 12-year-old boy whose older brother had died near Leipzig. The boy's handwriting was awkward, but the message clear. "Please, tell Mama he died for something. She says he died for nothing." Napoleon read it. He did not smile. He did not cry. He passed it to an aide and said, "Send him something. A flag, a medal, whatever we have." The aide, later questioned, said he placed the letter in a pouch of special correspondence, but no medal was ever sent. The mother never received anything. The boy's name, like his brother's, vanished from the rolls in the final year of the empire. Some ministers tried to stem the tide. They proposed to reform local review boards, regional correspondence officers, a kind of primitive triage system for petitions. But the empire was crumbling faster than it could reorganize. Communications between Paris and the provinces were regularly intercepted or delayed by enemy troops. Many prefectures simply stopped forwarding civilian mail altogether. A tragic irony emerged. The very expansion that made Napoleon powerful had made his people invisible in Rome. A letter from a group of musicians begging for funding to rebuild their destroyed conservatory was returned with a blank reply. In Warsaw, a schoolteacher's request for chalk and firewood was marked non-essential. In Geneva, a doctor wrote requesting soap for his hospital. He received a form letter thanking him for his patriotic spirit. No soap arrived. The archive system, once designed for accountability, became a graveyard. Letters were bundled into years, then buried physically and bureaucratically into categories like general grievances, redundant, emotional, and the most damning of all, no action required. That final stamp became a death sentence for the voices it silenced. No action required, no attention, no reply. It's in these forgotten folders, not the battlefield orders or treaties, that we see the human cost of empire most clearly. Because it wasn't the enemy bayonets that turned French loyalty into indifference. It was the silence, the quiet realization that no one was listening anymore. When the Allies entered Paris in 1814, they didn't just find soldiers surrendering, they found citizens already surrendered in spirit. Civilians who had written, begged, petitioned, and been ignored, and in the bowels of the administrative buildings, they found crates. So many crates, inside with thousands of unread letters, stacked in bundles, many unopened, some sealed with fading wax, others yellowed with age. A British officer described it in his report. More paper than purpose, a museum of unanswered questions. He took one letter as a souvenir. It was unsigned and undated. Just one line. All I wanted was to be known. No signature, no reply. Years later, historians would catalog some of these letters. A few would be reprinted in journals. One small collection was displayed in an exhibit titled Voices of the Empire, but most were lost to fire, flood, rats, and time. So what can we learn from this slow disaster? That even the most powerful regimes fall not only from war, but from neglect. Not just from guns, but from unopened envelopes. That when leaders become symbols too distant to touch, the people stop reaching. And when the people stop reaching, the silence grows. Napoleon believed in his star. But stars don't answer letters. And so, in the end, we're left with this. A man built a continent-spanning empire through force, vision, and bureaucracy. To the bureaucracy, buried the very voices he claimed to serve. And by the time he was ready to listen, the voices were gone. So tonight, if you hear scratching in the back of your memory some forgotten plea, some word never answered no dams, empires don't fall in battle. They fall in the inbox. Asterisk on the morning of 18 Premier, year 8 November, 1799. By the old calendar, the streets of Paris woke to the sound of splattering rain. Not a storm, exactly, but something colder, steadier, and more unnerving. The kind of drizzle that seeps into wool, slows the wheels of carriages, and turns gravel roads into sticky ribbons of mud. And on this day, fall days, it was deeply inconvenient, because this was the day Napoleon Bonaparte was meant to take control of France. The coup had been planned with military precision. Soldiers positioned at key checkpoints. Loyal politicians corralled, carriages arranged, papers prepared, speeches rehearsed. All of it timed carefully. Napoleon would arrive at the Council of 500, dissolve it with words and force, and place himself as first consul in a single, swift pivot of history. But what no one accounted for, no general included in his reports, was the weather. The rain started before dawn. It curled beneath doors and trickled through gaps in the slates of aging roofs. It soaked the uniforms of the Republican Guard standing beneath the trees at the Palais du Luxembourg. And worse, it delayed the couriers. 3 crucial messages. 1 for General Moreau, 1 for Lucien Bonaparte, and 1 for a skeptical member of the council still being persuaded, were late by nearly 2 hours. Why? Because the bridges were slick. Because the horses were skittish. Because the messengers had to stop and wrap their satchels in oilcloth to protect the ink. And because no one had a dry copy of the orders. This, then, is how the coup began, not with a trumpet, but with a man on horseback, shouting over a muddy puddle, "It's under my coat, but I can't read it anymore." That morning, the Palais Bourbon was crowded with damp men, lawmakers, soldiers, scribes. Many had arrived soaked to the bone, their wigs wilted, their shoes squelched. Some were shivering. Napoleon, known for his punctuality, arrived 40 minutes late. His trousers were stained at the knees, his hair flattened by drizzle. He was furious. He had expected a moment of grandeur. Instead, he was greeted by murmurs. In wet paper, Lucien Bonaparte. His brother and the current president of the Council of 500 tried to salvage the mood, but even his voice cracked from the damp dot, and so began one of the most consequential political takeovers in history. With fogged glasses, waterlogged scrolls, and lukewarm coffee served by a clerk wearing mismatched socks. The irony is this: the coup succeeded, but it nearly didn't, because the delay gave time for doubt. A few wavering politicians, who might have folded under the shock of a quick maneuver, used the rain delay to whisper in corners, to recalculate loyalties, to speculate. Some asked, "Why is Bonaparte late? Is this really happening?" Others wondered aloud whether the rumors were false. One even left entirely, went home, claimed illness. Another, Jean-Francois Algoro, stood for nearly an hour with his speech tucked inside a waxed pouch, watching the doors like a man waiting for an omen. Later he said, "Had the rain not slowed things down, I might have voted differently. Momentum matters." It was more than just wet paper and late couriers. The rain changed the texture of the day. Outside, the guards stationed along the Seine grew restless. They passed flasks. Some took shelter beneath archways, their bayonets clinking as they shifted. Orders became harder to enforce. One officer was overheard saying, "If this keeps up, we'll have to invade the council in soaking boots." And when the time finally came for Napoleon to enter the chamber, when the soldiers were marched up the stairs, dripping and shivering, it wasn't with the crispness of conquest. It was awkward, slippery. A few men stumbled. One nearly dropped his musket. Napoleon, for all his charisma, had to speak over the sound of dripping capes and coughing legislators. His voice cracked when he first declared the government dissolved, and someone known to history laughed. It was quiet. It didn't matter in the end. But imagine the fragility of that moment. Had the guards not held firm? Had Lucien not shouted down the dissent? Had the puddles grown deeper and the doubt stronger? Keatsry might have bent another way. We remember coups as precise, inevitable, but they are not. They are weather dependent. And that rain, it continued all through the day, down the backs of secretaries running between ministries, across the cobbled squares where boots left nervous impressions, through chimneys, into offices, onto the inkwells of hastily redrawn maps of governance. In the evening, after the council had been cleared and Napoleon declared victorious, one of his aides noted, "We were not triumphant. We were damp and exhausted." The official portraits never showed the stains on their collars. The statues never commemorate the courier who arrived too late to deliver the last appeal for calm, but it's all there beneath the umbrella of history, hidden in the rain. So as you walk beneath a stormy sky today, think of that quiet, drizzling coup of the paper that smeared, the shoes that squeaked, the plan that almost fell apart because of puddles, and ask yourself, how many revolutions have been lost because someone forgot to check the weather? The storm, still quiet and gray, seemed almost conspiratorial in its persistence. It wasn't a violent thunderclap or an angry deluge jest. That same steady curtain of drizzle, that dull sound and smothers ambition. It filled the gutters of Paris and smeared the chalk signs outside cafes, and it stayed with the Bonapartist camp long after the guards had taken their positions and the ink had dried on the first announcements of the day. Inside the orangery of St. Cloud, repurposed as a temporary meeting hall for the Council of 500, the atmosphere was damp in more ways than one. The walls, uninsulated and sweating slightly from condensation, pressed inward like the faces of a crowd. Oil lamps hissed faintly in corners. The air carried a strange mix of parchment, wet wool, and nervous breath. This is where Napoleon, only moments before, had stormed in with his soldiers, having grown tired of waiting for legal formalities to unfold. He had expected a hero's welcome, or at least stunned silence. What he received instead was uproar. The members of the council, many of them still soaked from the journey, were not impressed by his dramatic entrance. Some had waited hours in this hall without food or comfort, brooding under the gray morning. They were cold, underpaid, overpressured, and now they were being told, by a man not even part of the legislature, they were no longer needed. One deputy stood up and shouted, "Down with the dictator." Another lunged. Still another, perhaps in a rush of adrenaline tour, opened his waistcoat and dared Napoleon to strike him down. Napoleon, visibly shaken, stepped back, and here, once again, the rain played its role not directly, but in atmosphere. The humidity, the discomfort, the general malaise had fermented an edge of panic. Nerves were frayed. Everything was damp and tempers stuck together like wet paper. Asterisk in his memoirs. General Oguro would later write, "It is not always fear that undoes men. Sometimes it is wet feet and confusion." Bonaparte, cool-headed and ambitious, but younger than his brother, rushed to the center of the room, raising both arms. His coat was speckled with rain, and he looked more like a clergyman than a president. But his words carried weight. He declared the chamber compromised. He accused certain deputies of treason. He ordered the hall cleared for safety. A bold movement, one made possible only because the soldiers waiting outside were loyal not to France, but to Napoleon. Asterisk. And yet, even that wasn't guaranteed. For in the hour that followed, several of the soldiers would be approached by panicked deputies pleading for protection. Some were offered bribes. Others were threatened. The storm outside became a kind of silent battlefield for loyalties. The mud beneath their boots became symbolic. No one was standing on firm ground. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Paris, smaller ripples of confusion began to spread. A mid-level clerk at the Ministry of War, having heard only fragments of what was unfolding, locked himself in an archive room with the key to the gunpowder reserves. He would remain there for nearly 12 hours, terrified that he might accidentally authorize a civil war at the printing presses on Rue Saint-Honore. Hurried copies of proclamations were set in type and distributed across the city. Some of the papers had to be dried by candle heat because the rooms were too damp for proper ink absorption. One pressman quipped, "We're not printing revolution, we're steaming it." In the cafes and salons, word spread unevenly. Some believed the Directory had resigned. Others thought the Jacobin had returned. One group, in a tavern near the Marais, began to prepare barricades only to abandon them when the rain made the sandbags fall apart. And yet, the day dragged forward, waterlogged and tense, at the Palais du Luxembourg. The last few directors' sighs and ducos among them signed their resignations quietly. One reportedly used a pen so waterlogged that his signature bled into the parchment. Another demanded that a scribe rewrite the announcement in dry ink for posterity. But for Napoleon, the rain had become more than nuisance. It had become symbol. He would later speak of the coup as a moment of destiny, of writing a corrupted course. And yet, in the moment, he was forced to scramble. He revised speeches. He changed routes between checkpoints. He tried to dry his boots by the fireplace of a general's quarters, snapping at aides while pulling soggy notes from his coat. One servant claimed that Napoleon muttered to himself, "Should have done this in June." The fascinating irony is that none of this appears in the official version. The documents drawn up afterward clean, dry, and sealed with wax paint, the coup as bloodless, seamless, inevitable. The images engraved in stone showed Napoleon standing calmly above a group of fawning deputies, his sword still sheathed, his hands clean. But you and I know the truth now. He was drenched, his voice cracked, his hands trembled when he spoke. And, perhaps more importantly, his power in that moment was not certain. It was improvised, patched together with damp string and misfired protocol. For all his brilliance, Napoleon was navigating this day moment by moment, reacting as much to weather and whim as to ideology or strategy. The rain blurred everything: lines of command, lines of law, even the lines between success and failure. And by evening, when the final holdouts in the legislature were persuaded or silenced, and when the troops had returned to their barracks, soaked and groaning, Paris fell into the kind of exhausted stillness that comes only after a tense, uncertain storm. The next morning, the skies cleared. The streets steamed. The smell of drying horse dung and gun oil filled the air, and Napoleon, freshly declared first Consul of France, wrote his mother a letter. He said nothing about the rain, but one line lingered. The people respect strength of what they remember. His timing. Was it timing that saved him? Or was it merely luck the clouds didn't break harder, that a loyal guard didn't slip, that a deputy didn't shout 1 second louder? Would the council have resisted had they been dry? Would history have pivoted if the ink hadn't run? Asterisk. By the time the rain finally broke quietly, without fanfare, Paris looked like a city wrung out and left to dry. The cobblestones steamed gently in the low sun. Rooflines dripped steadily onto the shoulders of passers-by. The fog that had clung to windows and door frames began to lift, filling a city still uncertain of what had just occurred. The newspapers were first to speak. On the morning of November 10th, 1799, 20th of Brumaire, year the 8th in the revolutionary calendar, the people of Paris found broadsheets stacked on street corners and nailed 2 wooden posts. The headlines varied in tone, but not in message. The revolution was over. France had a new government. 3 consuls now stood in place of 5 directors, but one name stood tallest on the page. Napoleon. He had not taken power in the dead of night, nor on the tip of a blade in some fiery clash of loyalists and rebels. He had walked into a wet room filled with reluctant legislators, thrown up his hands, came through a mix of authority, confusion, and a slow grind of exhaustion. One dot. That, at least, was the version now being printed. But privately, in salons and behind drawn curtains, the story was different. People spoke of the soaked boots of soldiers slipping on parquet floors, of generals hiding nerves behind damp cravats, huff of the thunderous silence in the council chamber once Napoleon left, trailing water and shouted insults behind him, and in some homes, especially those of former revolutionaries, people did not read the newspapers aloud at all. They just stared at the pages and listened to the quiet, because in Paris, silence after a storm carries meaning. Napoleon, meanwhile, was already at work reshaping the narrative. He met with officials in carefully choreographed meetings where furniture was rearranged, candles relit, and mud swept away moments before his arrival. He dictated notes for pamphlets and speeches. He reassured allies and gently sidelined anyone unsure of the new arrangement. One of his first acts, to suppress further discussion of how, exactly, the transition had happened. The soldiers who cleared the legislature were told to forget the specifics. The generals were instructed to stick to one script. The clerks who copied reports were warned not to editorialize. The reign, in all its meddling glory, was quietly written out of the official version. Yet, in small ways, it lingered. A copy of Napoleon Bonaparte's handwritten orders, still slightly smudged by a water droplet, was filed in the archives under urgent assembly. A janitor at the orangery noted in a maintenance ledger that the floorboards near the west entrance were damaged by excessive moisture and agitation. The mid-level clerk, the same one who had hidden in the archive room with the gunpowder keys, wrote a private letter to his cousin in Lyon. We feared revolution. What we got was a puddle and a promise. For Napoleon, though, the storm marked the last moment he would ever truly not be in control. In the weeks that followed, he would consolidate power methodically. The new constitution of the year 8 was introduced. It granted the illusion of shared leadership among the 3 consuls, but in reality, all roads led back to Napoleon. His office was larger, its guards more numerous, his decisions final, yet the ghosts of the 19th of Brumaire haunted him in subtle ways. At his private residence, he insisted his boots be dried and brushed twice daily. He began requesting specific indoor venues for meetings rooms with good drainage, thicker carpets, and no history of leaks. On one occasion, when a roof tile rattled loose during a light drizzle, he ordered repairs to begin within the hour, even though the room remained dry. These weren't the actions of a man afraid of rain. They were the rituals of someone who had once been made vulnerable by it, and that vulnerability brief, visible in paintings, But real was what defined the true nature of the coup. Not heroism, not grandeur, but a series of small, sodden accidents. It wasn't the oratory that carried the day. It was fatigue, discomfort, and the slow erosion of resistance by damp circumstance. And in that sense, what Napoleon truly feared was not Britain, nor Austria, nor the Jacobin plotting in exile. He feared disorder. He feared uncertainty. He feared that even the strongest plans could be unraveled by weather. The rain didn't stop him, of course. It didn't undo the coup, but it did shape it. The greatest moment of his rise was not on a battlefield or under the arch of a golden hall. It was in a sweating, waterlogged chamber filled with tired men, torn papers, and the smell of wet wool. In the years to come, Brumaire would be hailed as a turning point, a masterstroke of military civic strategy. It's an elegant solution to a nation. Adrift, but real history is never that neat. Sometimes it's about boots tracking mud across legislative floors. Sometimes it's about crumpled speeches blurred by rain. Sometimes it's about the fact that France, in her moment of transition, simply couldn't keep the papers dry. And isn't that the essence of power? That even the boldest plans can dissolve slowly under a leaking roof. Asterisks before the stormy campaigns across Europe, before the imperial robes, and before his name carried the weight of an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte was a boy in a very small world shaped not by cannon, but by creeks and clouds. Corsica was not yet France in his young eyes. It was an island of rocks and hills, olive trees and goats, crickets and thunderstorms. It's a kind of place where weather wasn't just a topic of idle conversation, but a central fact of daily life. Rainfall could determine your evening meal, your road to school, and your father's mood. Ajaccio, the small town of his birth, was perched by the sea, but it was hemmed in by untamed land. Behind the houses lay hills that weren't quite mountains, carved by slow, stubborn rivers that twisted like sleepy snakes through the valleys. And it was in one of these valleys, at the foot of Monte Rotondo, where the story begins, not with a war, but with a trickle of water and a boy trying to impress his older brother. It was late spring. The air smelled of damp clay and smoke from hearths. Napoleon, about 9 years old, had decided that he would build a fort. Not a military one, at least not in his mind, just a stone hideout near the Fume Gravona, a river that often behaved more like a child than a stream. It sulked, dried, pouted, and occasionally exploded. That week, the waters had receded. Smooth rocks appeared like stepping stones across the riverbed. Napoleon, spindly-legged and sunburned, clambered down with his brother Joseph, hauling loose stones to create their imaginary stronghold on a narrow sandbar. It was a silly game, a castle of ankle-high walls and pine branches for spears. They fought invisible enemies, argued over where the moat should go, and ended the day muddy and triumphant. But Corsican weather has a short temper. In the mountains above, where clouds gathered without warning, rain had been falling steadily, not in Ajaccio, not where the children played, but higher, hidden in the slopes where goats disappeared into the mist. The Gravona, fed by narrow gullies, began to swell. Napoleon was back at the river the next morning, alone this time, determined to improve the fort. He noticed the water lapping a little closer to his walls, but he brushed it off. He liked to test things. How much higher would it go? How long would his walls last? We didn't realize that it wasn't just rising, it was rushing. By the time he heard the roar, more like a low rumble, there was already foam on the edges of the rocks. Pebbles began to shift under his feet. The trickle of the river became a quicksilver current. He panicked. He dropped a handful of stones, turned to climb up the bank, and slipped. His small legs weren't fast enough. The river slapped at his knees, then tugged at his thighs. His shoe floated off, spinning like a paper boat. He grabbed at a root, missed, and tumbled into the current. It wasn't deep, Not then, but it was. Fast, it carried him 10 feet, then 20, before a submerged log turned him sideways. His head went under. For a moment, the world was just green water and cold light. Then, arms, a pair of them, grasping his shirt, hauling him out, voice calling his name, again and again. It was a shepherd. An old man with a weather-battered face who had seen the boy from the ridge. Running too close to the river, Napoleon coughed up water, shivered violently, and then cried. Not out of fear, but out of frustration. The fort was gone. His creation had vanished. So all that remained was mud, flattened grass, and the wide, swirling flood that had betrayed him. He went home soaked, silent, and, shaken, his mother, Leticia, said nothing, at first only wrapped him in wool and placed him by the fire. His father, Carlo, scolded him once, then twice, before falling quiet. No one mentioned a flood again that week, but something in Napoleon remembered it. It wasn't just the fear, it was the insult of nature, the interruption. It wanted to build something. And the river in thinking, careless, inconvenient, had swept it away without reason. 4 years after, he avoided the banks of the Gravana. He preferred the rocky paths instead, where the land stayed still under his feet. When he did go near water, he approached it like an enemy, a thing to be measured, mastered, and never trusted again. That little river was hardly the Amazon, but to a boy, its betrayal was enormous, and yet was this moment marked in the history books that may have taught him something far more lasting than Latin lessons or fencing drills ever could. That control is temporary, it's that nature, like politics, has moods, and that the world often shifts without permission. What other ideas formed in the back of his damp, childlike mind that day? Did he feel the first stirrings of a need to command? Not just people, but outcomes. As he dried by the fire that night, listening to the rain beat against the shutters, did he already vow silently to never be caught unprepared again? Did flood, in its own quiet way, begin to shape the man who would one day redraw the map of Europe? We'll never know exactly, but there, on a washed-out riverbank in Corsica, a child met chaos for the first time, and that chaos did not feel like a lesson. It felt like a threat, one that he would spend the rest of his life trying to outthink. Napoleon didn't speak of the river after that day, not to his brother, Tia, not to his parents, not even when he returned to the spot weeks later to find only flattened reeds and half-buried stones. The makeshift fort was gone, of course, but so was something else, his innocence about the world. Corsica, for all its beauty, was a place of harsh lessons. Life was dictated by storms, shortages, and rivalries. Ativo didn't live so much as endure, and in the mind of a boy who had once believed that a wall of stones could withstand the force of a mountain-fed river, something hardened. It wasn't just about water, it was about chaos, and more importantly, it's the inability to stop it. That memory burrowed into him, not as a trauma, but as a dull, persistent itch, a hunger to never again be at the mercy of nature, or chance, or anything he didn't understand. Even as a child, Napoleon saw the world through a lens of systems. He watched people closely, how they traded favors, how they responded to fear, how they obeyed when spoken to with certainty. He learned quickly that adults didn't always act logically, and that authority could be shaped by tone more than truth, but nature. Nature didn't listen to tone. Rain did not obey. Rivers did not negotiate, so instead turned his attention to what could be controlled. Books, maps, timetables. He became obsessed with order, especially when it came to time. His school notebooks were not only filled with notes, but charts, lists, and plans. He even recorded the daily routine of the monastery bells nearby, tracking how often they deviated by minutes, depending on who rang them. While other boys memorized Latin declensions, Napoleon mapped out hypothetical supply routes between Corsican towns. He didn't just want to learn history. He wanted to predict it, to find its underlying pattern. The way one might chart the flow of a river before a flood, his teachers noticed something odd about him, a strange mix of discipline and quiet defiance. He followed rules when they suited him, but questioned them when they didn't. He once argued with a local priest about whether the heavens were truly immutable, pointing out that clouds moved without permission and stars sometimes fell. Wasn't blasphemy, it was curiosity. What kind of force, he wondered, could move the sky? Who or what controlled the forces that shifted empires, or raised floods, or decided when a child drowned and when he was saved? He didn't have the words yet, but already he was forming his own answer. Power. Not the loud kind, or the kind that relied on lineage, but the subtle kind, the quiet ability to foresee, to plan, to anticipate. That's what the river taught him, that even the gentlest force, left unchecked, could become overwhelming. And so, began crafting his life around preparation. By the time he entered the French military academy at Brienne, his Corsican accent made him a target. Other boys mocked him, called him a peasant. He didn't care how they joked. He calculated. He studied not only artillery and geography, but human behavior. He noticed who got away with breaking curfew. He noted which instructors could be swayed by flattery and which could not. It was around this time that he began keeping a private journal. Not of emotions, but of mistakes. Not his own, but other people's. Missed opportunities, delayed responses, poor assumptions. They would write out the decisions people made and how they could have made a better one. He reviewed it the way others reviewed vocabulary. He treated human error the way an engineer studies the bend of a bridge. When a fellow student once asked him why he always seemed so distant, Napoleon reportedly replied, "Because, even now, I am building something." That something wasn't a castle of rocks on a sandbar anymore. It was a mental fortress. A world in which floods did not surprise, and chaos was just a failure of foresight. He began to build a concept of predictive dominance, a belief that if you studied the world deeply enough, nothing could surprise you. This wasn't arrogance. Not yet. It was fear in disguise, and that fear stayed with him. Even as he grew stronger, he began to dread the idea of unknown variables. In school, he once gave up an afternoon of leisure just to understand how wind affected cannonball trajectories. He asked an instructor if the tides near Toulon could delay a ship's arrival by more than a day during certain moon phases. The instructor laughed. Napoleon didn't, even at 15. He was already planning for disasters most adults didn't think about, because in the back of his mind was always that moment when the stone fort vanished and the water rose too quickly to run. That single childhood incident might seem trivial in the grand scope of history, but in a life defined by conquest, strategy, and control, it may have been the first and most important loss, not because he was in danger of dying, but because he was helpless. And for a boy like Napoleon, helplessness was intolerable. Later in life, he would prepare for every scenario militarily, politically, emotionally. He would carry multiple watches. He would revise plans even after victories. He would overthink betrayals, stockpile supplies, second-guess his generals. He would learn to drown uncertainty with precision. And yet, no matter how many battles he won or treaties he signed, it was always the fear, not of the British dot, not of Russian snow, not even of assassination, but of the flood, the kind that comes quietly at first, the kind that seems playful, even cooperative, until it eyes ends. Some of the question lingers. Did that childhood moment give birth to a tactical genius? It was many years later, long after the stone fort was gone, and the riverbank had changed, shaped with time and season, when Napoleon returned to Corsica. Not as a child, not even as a hopeful officer of keys, but as a man with the weight of an empire in his stride. the future of Europe curling behind his thoughts like the tails of his coat. The homecoming wasn't key triumphant. Corsica had never quite belonged to him again after he left. The people there had grown wary of his ambition, suspicious of his loyalties, unconvinced by his success, and, perhaps more importantly, the island itself had moved on. The olive groves had grown deeper into the hillsides. The village roofs were newer. Children played games he no longer understood. His mother's house still stood, but the walls were quieter now. Even the air, once so familiar, tasted like something strained through memory. He could have avoided the river entirely. It would have been easy. No one would have blamed him for skipping a walk along a stretch of land no longer useful or symbolic. But something in him needed to see it, not out of nostalgia, but out of calculation, because somewhere inside he believed that if he could walk that path again, not as a boy, but as Napoleon Bonaparte, he might find some final answer. He went alone. No guards, no aides, just him, the silence, and the memory. The river was smaller than he remembered. It had narrowed over the years, its course gently shifted by time, by gravel, by some long-forgotten storm. The stones were not the same. The sandbar was gone, but the curve of the valley still echoed something ancient, like a breath paused mid-sigh. He stood at the edge and watched the water move, not crash, not rise, not roar, just move, smooth, lazy, unbothered. And that unsettled him more than anything, because it wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening. That was the real lesson the flood had taught him. Not that the world was cruel or dangerous, but that it simply didn't care. It would keep moving, whether you drowned or didn't, whether you built or fell, whether you were a Corsican boy with dirt on his knees or the crowned Emperor of France. The river did not pause to admire his victories. It did not remember the child who once built a castle from shell. It simply flowed, and in that moment, he understood something deeply unpleasant. No amount of control can conquer indifference. You could win 100 battles, sign treaties in gold, command armies that stretched for miles, and still, the river would not care. History, too, might pass you by, not out of malice, but out of the same gentle, unstoppable motion. It's what he feared most. Oblivion, not death. Death had rules. Death came with glory and consequence and finality. But oblivion, that slow erasure of memory, the kind that washes away the details until all that remains is a name in stone. If that was the true enemy, he thought of Carthage, of the pharaohs, of forgotten kings buried beneath grocery markets and parking lots. He thought of commanders whose tactics had shaped civilizations, now known only to scholars and NSOMNIACS. And he wondered, would his name, too, be reduced to a trivia question? Would children one day confuse him with a pastry? Would anyone remember? The stones, the rain, the fear, for a man who sought permanence in the impermanent. The river was a reminder he didn't want, and yet he stayed. He watched the ripples gather, then break. He let the sound of water over pebbles fill his thoughts like a hymn with no lyrics. He tried to imagine the boy again, the small one, with 2 big thoughts and 2 thin arms, stacking the wall against something he didn't understand. He tried to feel the terror of that moment when the water came too fast and the world seemed to tilt, but it didn't come, because he was no longer afraid of water. He was afraid of time, the way it moves forward without asking, the way it wears down stone, bends rivers, erases forts, the way it forgets. He remembered something his mother used to say. In the quiet hours when the house had gone still, even a stream can carry a secret if you're quiet enough to listen. And so, he listened, not for strategy, not for advantage, but for memory. He heard the scrape of pebbles against each other, the lapping against moss, the occasional snap of reeds. But there was no message, no secret, just motion. The same motion that had been there when he was small, and would be there long after his boots no longer pressed against the soil of any country. It was humbling, not because it diminished him, but because it clarified him. The fear that had followed him for decades, that gnawing, slow unease, born from a childhood moment of helplessness, wasn't about the river. It was about the futility of permanence. And in that realization, there was something almost comforting, because if even Napoleon Bonaparte could be forgotten, if even his name could dissolve into the stream of history, then so could his failures, his miscalculations, his regrets. They, too, would pass. And maybe that was the lesson he'd been missing all along. That true power isn't about resisting the current, it's about knowing how to let go. He turned from the river and walked back through the narrow path toward the olive groves, the low stones warm from the sun, the air smelling faintly of time and time. And somewhere behind him, the water kept moving,